The morning of Monday, July 28, 1986, started like any other Monday in London. The sun rose over Fulham. Traffic clogged the streets. Thousands of people woke up, made coffee, and headed to work. Nothing about the day announced itself as different. Nothing whispered that by nightfall, a young woman would vanish without a trace, and that 40 years later we still wouldn't know what happened to her. Suzy Lamplugh walked into her office that morning. She was 25 years old. Blonde hair. The kind of energy that made people turn their heads when she entered a room, not because of vanity but because she genuinely lit things up. She worked as an estate agent at Sturgis in Fulham, and she was good at it. Really good. The kind of agent who didn't just sell houses, she listened to people. She understood what they actually wanted, not what they thought they wanted. Her colleagues didn't just respect her, they liked her. They wanted to grab drinks with her. They wanted to be around her. She'd recently gotten out of a long-term relationship. And here's the thing that matters, she was happy about it. For the first time in years she was single, independent, building her own life. She had plans. Real plans. A trip to America she was saving for. Ideas about maybe starting her own business down the line. She was 25 and her life was finally becoming exactly what she wanted it to be. That Monday morning she arrived at the office like she always did. Around midday the phone rang. A man's voice on the other end. Come. Professional. He said his name was Mr. Kipper. He wanted to view a property. 3 bedrooms. Shrivemore Road in Fulham. The kind of call that came in dozens of times a week. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have raised any alarms. Suzy took the call. She wrote down the details. She told her colleagues, "I'm meeting Mr. Kipper at 12:45. She was careful like that. She followed protocol. She did everything right. At 12:45 p.m., she got in her white Ford Fiesta and drove toward Shrivemore Road. She never came back. In each video we dive deep into real-life crime stories, the mysteries and investigations that have shaped history and captivated the world. We focus on the details, the evidence, the timelines, the people. From cold cases that have baffled investigators to infamous crimes that shocked nations, we examine each case with the thoroughness it deserves. Crime scenes, forensic evidence, and the detective work that either solved these cases or left them open. If you're ready to uncover chilling cases and learn about the crimes that remain unchanged, subscribe to our channel. My name is Greg and welcome to Unchanged. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what she had. Suzy Lamplugh wasn't born into tragedy. She wasn't predestined for a missing persons poster. She was born into a military family, her father, Paul, a career serviceman who understood duty and discipline. Her mother, Diana, was the kind of woman who held things together, who made a home in whatever country the military sent them to. They moved constantly. Germany, Cyprus, all over. But they were a solid family. Stable in the way military families learn to be stable, adaptable, resilient, close-knit because they had to be. Suzy grew up moving between continents, never staying in one place long enough to put down deep roots. But that gave her something: flexibility, confidence. The ability to walk into a new school, a new country, and make it work. By the time she was a teenager, she'd learned how to read people, how to adapt, how to survive in transition. And then, like most military families eventually do, they settled. By her early 20s, Suzy was living in London. She'd chosen a state agency as her career, a job that played to her strengths. She was good with people. She could read what they wanted. She could walk into a house and see its potential. She could sell not just property but possibility. At Sturgis she was already making a name for herself. Not just as competent but as genuinely talented. The kind of agent clients asked for by name. She was 25 years old. And she'd recently gotten out of a long-term relationship. Here's what matters about that: she wasn't heartbroken. She wasn't destroyed. She was relieved. The relationship had run its course. It had held her back. And now, for the first time in her adult life, she was single. Genuinely single. Not recovering from a breakup. Actually, authentically free. Her flat was her own. Her time was her own. Her choices were her own. She had friends she could call on a whim. Colleagues she actually liked, not just tolerated. She was talking about taking a trip to America. Real plans. Forward momentum. The kind of life that a 25-year-old with her whole life ahead of her should be living. She was happy. Not deliriously happy. Not naive or reckless. But genuinely, solidly happy. The kind of happiness that comes from independence and possibility and knowing that your life is moving in the right direction. She had ambitions. She was building something. She had time. She had everything. But here's the thing about happiness. It's invisible to the people around you. It doesn't protect you. It doesn't make you safer. And on the morning of July 28, 1986, Suzy Lamplugh had no idea that her happiness, that entire future she'd built in her mind, was about to be erased by a phone call from a man named Mr. Kipper. Monday morning arrived like every other Monday morning in London. The sun rose over the Thames. Traffic began its slow crawl through the streets of Fulham. Office workers emerged from the underground, coffee cups in hand, mentally preparing themselves for another week. The world was spinning exactly as it always did, indifferent, routine, utterly ordinary. At Sturgis Estate Agents on Putney Hill, the office was already beginning to hum with the low-level energy of a Monday. Phones would start ringing within the hour. Clients would begin calling about viewings. Colleagues would settle into their desks, checking messages from the weekend, organizing their schedules for the week ahead. It was the kind of day that no one would remember as significant. No one would mark it on a calendar. No one would say, that was the day everything changed. Except it was. Suzy arrived at the office in the morning, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of someone who'd done it 100 times before. She'd taken this route countless times. Parked her white Ford Fiesta in the same spots. Walked through the same doors. Hung her bag on the same hook. Made tea in the same kitchen. Said good morning to the same faces. Every action was a repetition of the 1,000 mornings that had come before. There was nothing to distinguish this Monday from any other Monday. The office itself was a typical estate agency of the 1980s. Desks scattered throughout. Papers everywhere. Property listings pinned to walls. Photos of houses waiting to be sold. A phone system that rang constantly. The smell of strong tea and the low-level stress that comes with commission-based work. Everyone in the office had one job: sell houses. Make calls. Schedule viewings. Close deals. It was competitive but collegial. Professional but human. The kind of workplace where people actually knew each other, actually worked together, actually cared about their colleagues' success. Suzy had been working there long enough to be fully integrated into that ecosystem. She wasn't new. She wasn't the person people had to figure out. She was established. Trusted. The kind of agent who could handle her own caseload, who didn't need micromanaging, who actually brought in business. Her colleagues knew her well enough to know her habits. To know that she was reliable. To know that if she said she'd be somewhere, she'd be there. To know that if something seemed off, she'd tell you. She wasn't the type to disappear without explanation. She wasn't the type to be reckless. She was competent. Professional. Someone you could depend on. This matters because later, when she disappeared, no one would think she'd left on purpose. No one would think she'd run away. No one would think she'd gotten into trouble through her own carelessness. Everyone who knew her would understand, immediately and instinctively, that something had happened to her. That this wasn't a choice. This was something else entirely. But that understanding would come later. On Monday morning, Suzy was simply settling into her workday. The hours passed with the strange slowness that Monday mornings have. Time moves differently on Mondays. Minutes feel longer. The day stretches out ahead of you. And then, around midday, the kind of time when people are thinking about lunch, when the morning has lost its energy but the afternoon hasn't quite started, the phone rang. It wasn't an unusual call. A man's voice. Calm. Professional. Polite. He said his name was Mr. Kipper. He wanted to view a property. 3 bedrooms. He was interested in Shrivemore Road. Could she arrange a viewing? The kind of inquiry that came in dozens of times every single week. Routine. Standard. The backbone of estate agency work. Suzy took the call professionally. She had a pen in her hand, agents always did. She had a notepad in front of her, agents always did. She took down the information. Mr. Kipper. 3 bedrooms. Shrivemore Road. A viewing. She would have asked him questions. When would you like to view? What's your budget? Are you a first-time buyer? What are you looking for in a property? The standard questions that agents ask to understand their clients, to qualify them, to determine if they're serious or just browsing. Mr. Kipper answered the questions. Or he didn't. The details of that conversation have been lost to time. What we know is that a viewing was arranged. A time was set. 12:45 p.m. Suzy wrote it down. And then she did something that was entirely routine, entirely normal, entirely unremarkable. She told her colleagues where she was going. I'm meeting Mr. Kipper at 12:45, she said. Or words to that effect. It was the kind of thing agents do all the time. They tell people where they'll be. They log their movements. They follow protocol. It's a safety measure, but it's also just practical. Colleagues need to know where you are in case a client calls looking for you. in case you need to be reached, in case something goes wrong. Suzy followed protocol. She was careful like that. The morning continued. More calls came in. More work happened. The office maintained its ordinary rhythm. And then, as noon approached, Suzy prepared to leave for her appointment. She gathered her things. Keys, bag, whatever materials she needed to show the property. She told people she was heading out. She got in her white Ford Fiesta and drove toward Shrivemore Road. It was a journey she'd made 1,000 times before, navigating London streets, finding addresses, driving to properties all across the city. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing that should have raised any alarms. Just another agent heading out to show another property to another potential client. The car itself was ordinary too. A white Ford Fiesta. Not flashy. Not memorable. Just a reliable car that got her where she needed to go. The kind of car you might pass on the street and not notice. The kind of car that could disappear into London traffic without drawing any attention. She was driving toward an address. Toward a man she'd never met. Toward a viewing that had been requested by a voice on the phone. Toward whatever came next. But before she arrived at Shrivemore Road, let's pause here. Let's understand what was about to happen in the context of what was ordinary about this day. Because this is the crucial thing about predatory violence. It hides inside normalcy. It travels through routine. It arrives in the form of a phone call that sounds like 100 other phone calls. It wears the mask of an ordinary Monday. A man calls an estate agency. He says his name is Mr. Kipper. He wants to view a property. Nothing in that request is alarming. Nothing in that interaction is unusual. Nothing in that phone call should have triggered any instinct in Suzy to be afraid, to be suspicious, to be careful in a way beyond the usual professionalism of her job. Mr. Kipper sounded like a client. He acted like a client. He requested something that clients request every single day. There was nothing that would have warned Suzy about what was coming. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Because somewhere in London on the morning of July 28, 1986, a predator woke up. Whether he planned this carefully or whether the opportunity simply presented itself, we'll never know. Whether he saw Suzy's name in an advertisement, whether he called multiple agencies looking for a young woman, whether it was entirely random or entirely calculated, we don't know. We can't know. That knowledge died with him or it's locked in his silence. But somewhere, someone decided that on this particular Monday, they would call an estate agency and request a viewing. They would give a false name. They would arrange a meeting with a young woman they'd never met. And they would do it in such a way that it seemed completely ordinary, completely routine, completely safe. They were predatory. They were calculating. They were evil. And they knew how to hide it inside the normalcy of a Monday afternoon. So Suzy drove toward Shrivemore Road, following protocol, being careful, doing everything right, and none of it mattered. She parked her white Ford Fiesta somewhere near the property. She got out of the car. She waited for Mr. Kipper to arrive. Minutes passed. The afternoon was ordinary. The street was ordinary. The house was ordinary. And then Mr. Kipper never showed up. It was such a mundane disappointment. A client not appearing for a viewing. It happened all the time. But in that moment, Suzy had no idea that she'd just escaped something. That the absence of Mr. Kipper at that location meant she was still alive. That the moment he didn't arrive was the moment she was saved from whatever he'd planned. She didn't know that. She just knew that a client had stood her up. That she'd wasted an afternoon. That she'd need to follow up. That she'd file a report or make a note. That she'd move on to the next thing. She had no idea that the real danger was still coming. That Mr. Kipper had simply changed his plan. That being a no-show at Shrivemore Road didn't mean he'd given up. It meant something else entirely. Something worse. By 6 p.m. on Monday evening, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was the kind of shift that starts as a whisper and only becomes a scream in hindsight. The kind of wrongness that, when you're living through it, you can almost convince yourself is nothing. Just a missing person. Just someone running late. Just a delay that would resolve itself by morning. Except it didn't resolve. And the wrongness kept growing. Suzy had returned to the office after waiting at Shrivemore Road. Mr. Kipper had never appeared. She'd reported it, another no-show, another wasted afternoon. It happened. Clients changed their minds. Clients got held up. Clients forgot. The real estate business was built on a certain percentage of flakiness. You scheduled 10 viewings, maybe 8 people showed up. That was normal. That was expected. So when Suzy came back, it wasn't a crisis. It was just another Monday afternoon inconvenience. The office wound down as late afternoon became evening. People packed up their things. Colleagues headed home. The phone stopped ringing with the same urgency. The energy that had hummed through the morning and early afternoon began to dissipate. Monday evening in an estate agency, people were tired, ready to leave, mentally already at home. Suzy should have left too. But something about Mr. Kipper was bothering her. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. The kind of small wrongness that nags at you without reason. Maybe it was something in his voice. Maybe it was the specificity of the request. 3 bedrooms, Shrivemore Road, delivered with such certainty that he must have known the property. Maybe it was simply that he'd bothered to call at all if he never intended to show up. Or maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just Suzy being a thorough professional, thinking about a job that hadn't gone as planned. But she mentioned it to people at the office. "That's strange," she said. Or something like that. The exact words are lost now, 40 years later, buried in the fog of memory and incomplete records. What matters is that she said something. That she noted the oddness. That she didn't just let it pass without comment. Her colleagues listened. They acknowledged it. Yes, it was odd. But also, not that odd. Not unusual enough to worry about. Not unusual enough to act on. Just a minor irritation, a small mystery that would probably resolve itself or simply be forgotten by tomorrow. No one thought twice about it. And then Suzy should have gone home. She should have left the office, driven to her flat, changed out of her work clothes, made dinner, called a friend, done any of the 1,000 ordinary things that people do on Monday evenings. She should have continued her life, unaware that this was the last Monday evening she would ever experience. But she didn't go home. By early evening, around 6 p.m., her mother, Diana, began trying to reach her. This wasn't unusual in itself. Diana was a mother, she called her daughter. They had that kind of relationship. Close. Connected. The kind where a parent checks in, where they want to know what their child is doing, how their day was, what's happening in their life. Diana wasn't overbearing or controlling. She was just a mother who cared and who maintained contact with her daughter. But on this particular Monday evening, something in Diana's attempt to reach Suzy was different. The phone rang. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Diana knew Suzy's routine. She knew that her daughter would typically be home by this hour. She knew that Suzy was reliable, that she would return calls, that she would make contact if she was going to be late or doing something different. And so when the phone kept going unanswered, when there was no answer at the flat, when there was no explanation, that's when the first real wrongness began. It started small. A concerned mother trying to reach her daughter. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would justify calling the police. Just a growing sense that something wasn't quite right. The kind of feeling that mothers get sometimes. An intuition that something is off. Diana kept trying. She called the office. Had anyone seen Suzy? Had she mentioned anything about staying late? About plans for the evening? About anywhere she was going? The people at the office, the colleagues who'd seen her earlier, began to piece things together. Suzy had come back from the viewing. She'd mentioned the no-show. She'd said something about it being odd. And then, what? Had she left? Had she stayed? Had she mentioned going anywhere? No one was entirely sure. The memory of an ordinary Monday evening becomes murky when it's no longer ordinary. Details that seemed insignificant at the time suddenly matter desperately. When did she leave? What was she wearing? Had she said anything about going anywhere else? Had she mentioned plans? By 8 p.m., the wrongness had solidified into something more concrete. Diana was genuinely worried now. Not panicked yet, but worried in the way that mothers worry when their children don't answer phones. She called friends. She called colleagues. She reached out to anyone who might have seen Suzy or known where she was. And each call that wasn't answered, each person who said, "I don't know where she is," each moment of uncertainty reinforced the growing sense that something had genuinely gone wrong. This wasn't Suzy being out late. This wasn't Suzy having plans she'd forgotten to mention. This was Suzy being unreachable. This was Suzy being missing. And that was wrong in a way that couldn't be explained away. By 10 p.m., Diana had called the hospitals. It's a terrible thing that a parent can do. Call hospitals at night, give a description of your missing child, ask if anyone matching that description has been admitted. Ask if there's been an accident. Ask if your worst fears have come true. It's the kind of phone call that transforms a simple missing person into something more serious. It's the moment when "I can't reach my daughter" becomes "something has happened to my daughter." The hospitals had no record of Suzy. No admissions matching her description. No accidents. No emergencies. She simply hadn't been brought to any hospital in London that evening. And that non-answer was somehow more terrifying than any answer would have been. By midnight, Less than 12 hours after she'd left the office to meet Mr. Kipper, the wrongness had become absolute. Suzy Lamplugh was missing. Not lost. Not running late. Not staying with a friend she'd forgotten to mention. Missing. Genuinely, definitively missing. No one knew where she was. No one had heard from her since early afternoon. No one could explain what had happened to her. The police were called. A missing persons report was filed. A young woman, 25 years old, last seen heading to a property viewing. An appointment with someone named Mr. Kipper. A man no one had ever met. A man whose name might not even be real. A man who'd called once, made an appointment, and then, in some way that no one fully understood, had taken a young woman and erased her from the world. But here's what made this wrongness so terrifying. No one knew yet that it was truly wrong. When the police arrived to take the missing persons report, they couldn't yet know that this was the beginning of a 40-year mystery. They couldn't know that Suzy Lamplugh would never be found. They couldn't know that this Monday evening, this ordinary Monday evening, was the moment when everything would change, not just for Suzy but for her entire family, for the police force, for an entire nation that would follow her case with desperate hope that, somehow, somewhere, an answer would emerge. They just knew that a young woman was missing and that she'd been heading toward a viewing for a man who didn't exist. Or a man who did exist and was never caught. Or something in between. Some possibility so dark and so complete that the truth was worse than any explanation. The wrongness was just beginning. It would spread like a stain through the coming hours, the coming days, the coming weeks, the coming decades. It would infect everyone it touched. It would spawn theories and investigations and heartbreak that would never fully heal. But on this Monday night, as midnight approached and Suzy's photograph was being prepared for newspapers, the wrongness was still crystallizing. It was still forming. It was still becoming real. And no one yet understood that they were standing at the threshold of a mystery that would define their lives. Tuesday morning arrived with a clarity that Monday had lacked. The sun rose over London. Another day began. Traffic resumed its familiar patterns. The city moved forward with the indifference that cities have, unconcerned with the private crises of individual people, focused only on its own perpetual motion. But for Diana Lamplugh, for the police officers who'd taken the missing persons report, for everyone connected to Suzy's disappearance, Tuesday morning was not ordinary. It was the moment when the wrongness of Monday night crystallized into something concrete and terrifying. The police had spent Monday night working, making calls, checking hospitals and accident reports, reaching out to contacts, doing the initial work of a missing persons investigation. But missing persons cases in 1986 often resolved themselves. People turned up. They showed up at home with an embarrassed explanation. They'd been with a friend they'd forgotten to mention. They'd had an accident and been in a hospital that wasn't initially checked. They'd simply made a poor choice and lost track of time. But Suzy hadn't turned up. By Tuesday morning, the police knew something was genuinely different about this case. And then came the call. A car had been found. It was a white Ford Fiesta. Abandoned. Located in Stevenage, a town roughly 20 miles north of Fulham. The car was Suzy's. The registration matched. There was no doubt about it. The vehicle that she'd driven toward Shrivemore Road the afternoon before had been found 20 miles away, left behind like a discarded thing. What the police discovered when they examined that car would transform this from a missing person case into something far darker. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back. Suzy was 5 feet 8 inches, a relatively average height. But the seat had been adjusted for someone significantly taller. Someone much larger. Someone who had occupied that space after Suzy had driven the car to wherever it had been abandoned. This meant only one thing. Someone else had been driving the car. Someone other than Suzy had gotten behind that wheel and driven it from Fulham to Stevenage. Someone had taken control of her vehicle and piloted it away from the scene. Someone had taken her. The implications crashed down like a wave. This wasn't a case of a young woman who'd gotten confused or run away or made a terrible choice. This was a case of abduction. This was a case where a predator had taken control of Suzy's car and driven it away from the location where he'd taken her. This was a case where a victim had been removed from the scene of her disappearance. But that wasn't all. When police examined the car more thoroughly, they found something else. Or rather, they found the absence of something. Suzy's handbag was gone. Her bag, which she would have had with her for the viewing, which would have contained her wallet, her keys, her identification, her personal effects. It had vanished. And more chillingly, her shoes were missing. 2 shoes. Gone from the car. Left behind, or taken away, in some scenario that investigators couldn't yet reconstruct. But their absence spoke volumes. It suggested struggle. It suggested violence. It suggested a scenario that had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. There was no blood in the car. No obvious signs of a struggle. No broken glass. No torn fabric. No evidence of the physical violence that such an abduction might have entailed. But the absence of blood wasn't reassuring. It was worse in its way, because it suggested that whatever had happened to Suzy, it had happened quickly. It had happened with control. It had happened in such a way that left minimal trace evidence. It had the hallmark of someone who knew how to take a person without leaving obvious signs of the taking. The police brought in forensic teams. They examined every surface of that white Ford Fiesta. They photographed it. They documented it. They searched for any microscopic evidence that might tell them what had happened inside that car. They were looking for hair, for fibers, for skin cells, for anything that might place someone else in the vehicle with Suzy. What they found was limited. The car had been driven. It had been abandoned. And then it had been exposed to the elements, to the passage of time, to the erosion of evidence that comes with abandonment. But the most damning evidence was the simplest, the car itself. The fact that it had been found at all meant that whoever had taken Suzy had left behind her vehicle. They'd either A. Abandoned it deliberately, not caring if it was found, B. Been dropped off at this location by an accomplice, C. Had their own transportation waiting, D. Had taken some other means of escape. None of these scenarios were good. Because in each scenario, Suzy was absent from her own car. Suzy was somewhere else. Suzy was with whoever had taken her, and that person or those people were capable enough to plan an abduction, to execute it cleanly enough to leave minimal evidence, and to walk away from the scene. This was not an impulsive crime. This was not a crime of passion. This bore the hallmark of predatory calculation. By Tuesday afternoon, the story had transformed. What had been a missing person case became an abduction investigation. What had been a puzzle became a crime. What had been an unknown danger became a specific, terrifying threat. The police released details to the media. A young woman missing since Monday. Last seen heading to a property viewing. An appointment with someone called Mr. Kipper, a man who didn't seem to exist. A car found abandoned in Stevenage. Missing shoes. Missing handbag. Signs of an abduction. Suzy Lamplugh's photograph appeared in newspapers across Britain. She was smiling in the photos, professional headshots, probably from her work at the estate agency. A young woman with blonde hair, clear eyes, a pleasant expression. A woman who looked like she had her entire life ahead of her. A woman who looked like she should be alive, should be working, should be planning that trip to America she'd been saving for. Instead, she was missing. And the nation began to ask, where is Suzy Lamplugh? The investigation expanded rapidly. Police began to search the areas around where the car had been found. They organized search teams. They knocked on doors in Stevenage. They asked if anyone had seen a white Ford Fiesta being abandoned. Had anyone seen a young blonde woman? Had anyone seen anything unusual? The searches turned up nothing. They broadened their investigation. They looked for anyone named Kipper in the London area. Hundreds of Kippers. None of them had called Sturgis on Monday. None of them had reason to view a property. None of them matched the description that agents at the office could vaguely provide. A man's voice on the phone, calm, professional, utterly ordinary. They checked sex offenders in the area. They looked for predators with a history of targeting young women. They examined unsolved crimes from the surrounding region. Had there been other disappearances? Other abductions? Other cases that might be connected? And slowly, terrifyingly, they began to realize that they might not have much to go on. Mr. Kipper was a ghost. A name that might not be real. A voice that belonged to no one they could identify. A phantom client who'd called an office, made an appointment, and then vanished into the fabric of the crime itself. The only concrete evidence they had was the car. The adjusted seat. The missing shoes. The missing handbag. And Suzy, missing, unaccounted for, somewhere in the city or beyond it, in circumstances that no one yet understood. By the end of Tuesday, the police had what they needed to know. Suzy Lamplugh had been taken by someone who knew how to take people. Someone who had planned carefully enough to arrange an appointment, execute an abduction, and disappear. Someone who was still out there, somewhere in London or beyond, and who had successfully removed a young woman from the world. And they had almost no idea who he was. Diana Lamplugh spent Tuesday in a different kind of horror than she'd experienced Monday night. Monday had been the horror of not knowing. Tuesday was the horror of knowing that something terrible had happened, but having no idea what. Knowing that her daughter had been taken. Knowing that her daughter was in the hands of someone with predatory intent. Knowing that time was passing, hours now since Suzy had disappeared, and that with each passing hour the likelihood of finding her alive was diminishing. She gave interviews to the media. She appealed for information. She asked anyone who'd seen anything to come forward. She put her daughter's face on television and newspapers on the street. She did everything a mother could do when her child has been taken, and it was all desperately, achingly insufficient. Because the man who'd taken Suzy, if he was watching, if he was seeing his crime being investigated, was still ahead of them. He was still free. He was still unknown. And he had already demonstrated that he knew how to make a person disappear. By Wednesday morning, the investigation had begun to fracture into 1,000 different directions. What had started as a straightforward missing person case, find the girl, bring her home, had become something far more complex. The evidence contradicted itself. The leads went nowhere. The theories multiplied. And with each new direction the investigation took, it seemed to move further away from Suzy rather than closer to her. The police were thorough. They were dedicated. They were working around the clock. But they were also operating in the fog of a predatory crime with almost no starting point. They had a name that probably wasn't real. They had a voice with no face. They had a car that had been abandoned but yielded minimal forensic evidence. And they had a victim who had simply vanished. The maze began immediately. Police released a photo-fit image based on descriptions from agents at Sturgis. It was supposed to be Mr. Kipper, the man who'd called to arrange the viewing. But the description was vague. A man's voice. Calm. Professional. That was nearly all anyone could say with certainty. Unknown. Appearance? No one had seen him. Built? No one knew. The photo-fit image that was circulated, a generic-looking man with generic features, could have been almost anyone. Hundreds of people called the police tip line. They'd seen a man matching that description. They knew someone who'd called an estate agency. They had a theory. They had a suspicion. They had a name. Each lead was followed. Each one went nowhere. Police checked every estate agency in London. Had anyone else received a call from someone claiming to be Kipper? Had anyone arranged a viewing with a man using that name? The answer across the city was a consistent no. Which meant either Mr. Kipper had called only Sturgis, or he'd used different names at different agencies, or he was a phantom that existed only in the moment of that single phone call. They expanded the search to estate agencies outside London, then across the entire country, then to property management companies, then to landlords. The net kept expanding, the theory evolving. Maybe he'd called other agencies. Maybe this wasn't his first attempt. Maybe he'd done this before. But the answer remained the same. No one could find him. Police began to investigate Suzy's personal life with the intensity that violent crime investigations require. They spoke to her friends. They spoke to her colleagues. They spoke to people she'd dated. They spoke to her family members. They were looking for anything that might explain her disappearance. Was she involved with someone dangerous? Had she made an enemy? Had she been in debt? Had she been involved in any illegal activity? Was there anything in her life that might have made her a target? The answer from everyone was consistent. No. Suzy was a good person. She was competent. She was professional. She was happy. She had no obvious enemies. She wasn't in debt. She wasn't involved in anything questionable. She was simply a young woman living her life, working her job, planning her future. Which meant the danger hadn't come from her life. The danger had come from outside. The danger had been introduced through that phone call. The danger had walked through the door labeled Mr. Kipper and had taken her. But that realization didn't help them find him. The police looked at sex offenders in the area. Known predators. Men with histories of violence against women. Men with stalking behaviors. Men with abduction histories. They interviewed dozens. They investigated hundreds. They looked for anyone who might match the phantom profile of Mr. Kipper. Nothing connected. No one confessed. No one's story aligned with the evidence. No one had a clear motive or opportunity that could be proven. It was as if Mr. Kipper had simply materialized on Monday afternoon, made a phone call, and then evaporated back into the ordinary world from which he'd emerged. The investigation began to splinter into competing theories. Theory 1. Mr. Kipper was a deliberate pseudonym used by someone local to London who knew the estate agency system. Someone who was familiar with how viewings worked, how estate agents operated, how the logistics of property showing functioned. Someone sophisticated enough to plan an abduction carefully enough that it left minimal trace evidence. Theory 2. Mr. Kipper was a one-time killer who'd seen an opportunity and acted on impulse. Someone who'd called randomly, gotten lucky that a young woman had answered, and then improvised the abduction from there. Theory 3. Mr. Kipper was part of a larger criminal operation, a trafficking ring, an organized predatory network, someone making calls on behalf of others, someone connected to a larger machinery of violence. Theory 4. Mr. Kipper was someone Suzy knew, someone who'd deliberately disguised his voice on the phone, someone who'd orchestrated this abduction with inside knowledge of her schedule, her work, her movements. Each theory led to different investigative paths. Each theory demanded different evidence. Each theory made assumptions that couldn't be verified. And with each theory, the investigation moved further into the maze. Police brought in forensic psychologists. They built profiles of the killer they were looking for. What kind of person commits this crime? What motivations drive predatory abduction? What psychological patterns might help them identify the perpetrator? The profiles painted a picture of someone sophisticated, someone with planning ability, someone with predatory intent but enough self-control to execute it without leaving obvious evidence, someone who'd either killed before or had fantasized about killing extensively, someone who was likely to reoffend. But profiles don't identify specific people. Profiles describe categories of people. And the category of sophisticated predator contains thousands of possibilities. The public became invested in the mystery. Suzy's face was everywhere. On television, in newspapers, on buses and posters. The nation became aware of her disappearance. People began to theorize about what had happened. People called the police with tips. People formed their own investigative committees. Amateur detectives began to emerge. People who became obsessed with the case. People who saw patterns where no patterns existed. People who were convinced they knew who Mr. Kipper was based on hunches and intuitions and incomplete information. Each theory added to the noise. Each amateur investigation created more leads for the police to check. The signal began to disappear into the static. And then came the disappointments. A man in Scotland reported that he'd seen someone matching Mr. Kipper's description. Police investigated. Dead end. A psychic claimed to know where Suzy's body was buried. Police searched. Found nothing. A woman reported that her ex-boyfriend was suspicious and behaved like Mr. Kipper might behave. Police interviewed him. He wasn't connected. An estate agent from Manchester said they'd received a similar call with a similar request but from someone claiming to be Mr. Richards. Police investigated. Turned out to be a real client with a real name. Each lead was followed to its conclusion and yielded nothing. The maze had dead ends at every turn. By the end of Wednesday, by the end of that first full week of investigation, the police were beginning to confront a terrifying possibility. They might never solve this. The evidence might never be sufficient. The perpetrator might never be identified. Suzy might remain missing permanently, her fate unknown, her killer unpunished. Diana Lamplugh watched her daughter's case become a media phenomenon. She watched investigators work. She watched leads be followed and abandoned. She watched the police struggle with the same maze that was trapping everyone involved in the investigation. And she held on to the thread of hope that remains available to the families of missing persons. That somewhere, someone knows something. That somewhere Mr. Kipper is real. That somewhere there is an answer. But with each passing day, as the investigation expanded and complicated and fractured into 1,000 different theories, the maze seemed to grow. The walls seemed to multiply. And the center of the maze, the truth about what had happened to Suzy, seemed to retreat further and further into shadow. The investigation had become a machine that consumed energy without producing results. It ground on because it had to grind on. Because Suzy was still missing. Because someone had taken her. Because somewhere in London, or beyond it, someone knew the answer and that person was not coming forward. The maze had no exit. And Suzy remained lost somewhere inside it, 40 years later still waiting for the investigators to find the path that would lead to her, to the truth, to justice. But the maze kept growing. And the truth kept hiding. And the investigation spiraled deeper into complexity, further from resolution, into the realm of unsolved mysteries. 40 years have passed. 40 years since that Monday afternoon in July 1986 when a phone rang at Sturgis Estate Agents and a voice said a name and arranged an appointment. 40 years since Suzy Lamplugh drove toward Shrivemore Road and never came back. 40 years since her white Ford Fiesta was found abandoned in Stevenage with its seat pushed back and her shoes missing. 40 years of investigation. 40 years of theories. 40 years of dead ends and false leads and desperate hope and crushing disappointment. 40 years of a mystery that consumed a nation, that defined a generation's understanding of vulnerability, that transformed how we think about missing persons and predatory violence. And Suzy is still missing. That is the fundamental fact that remains unchanged after 4 decades. We don't know what happened to her. We know she was taken. We know it was deliberate. We know someone planned it carefully enough to leave minimal evidence. We know that whoever took her was sophisticated enough to disappear afterward and never be caught. But we don't know who he was. We don't know where he took her. We don't know what he did. We don't know if she suffered. We don't know if she's buried somewhere in London or thrown into the Thames or hidden in some location that will never be discovered. We know almost nothing. The investigation continued for decades. Police followed thousands of leads. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They searched parks and forests and abandoned buildings. They dredged rivers. They examined DNA evidence when DNA technology became available. They looked for connections to other crimes. They published new appeals. They released new information. And they found nothing. Over the years, suspects emerged. Men who were considered possibilities. A local handyman with a history of violence who died before he could be properly interrogated. A man convicted of similar crimes who fit some profiles. A property developer with suspicious behavior patterns. A man in prison who claimed to have information. Each suspect generated hope. Each one led nowhere. Mr. Kipper remained a ghost. The name was never definitively linked to a real person. No one came forward and said, "That was me on the phone." No confession emerged. No deathbed revelation solved the mystery. Mr. Kipper simply stayed suspended in time. A phantom killer, a voice without a face, a predator who'd executed one perfect crime and then vanished. Diana Lamplugh, Suzy's mother, spent decades campaigning for answers. She gave interviews. She appealed to the public. She pushed the police to pursue new leads. She became the face of a parent's grief, not the hysterical, dissolving grief that victims' families sometimes experience, but the steady, relentless, focused grief of someone determined that her daughter would not be forgotten. She died in 2017, still without knowing what happened to her daughter. That might be the cruelest aspect of this case, that the people closest to Suzy, the people who loved her most, lived their entire remaining lives without knowing the answer to the most basic question. What happened to her? Diana never got to bury her daughter. She never got to say goodbye. She never got to move through the stages of grief that closure might have provided. She was frozen in that first moment of wrongness, that Tuesday morning when the car was found, in the perpetual limbo of not knowing.